Workers at a hydroelectric dam face a dramatic fight for survival after an unbelievable catastrophic failure. The nightmare that follows will be absolute torture for some, and death for others. This is the fatal breakdown of the Sayano Shushenskaya Dam Accident. It was just an average Monday morning at the Sayano Shushenskaya hydroelectric plant, for the dozen or so workers who usually manage operations there. This dam had 10 turbines, which converted the flow of the river into electricity for a large area in southern Siberia, Russia. Nikolai and Oleg were in the turbine gallery, monitoring the 10 turbines that generated power in this hydroelectric dam. Nikolai's son, Roman, was down in the engine room managing mechanics with Alexander. They were all going about their work shifts with just one small inconvenience. There were over 100 people on site on this day, August 17, 2009. The plant director was celebrating his company anniversary with a gathering of 50 people in the turbine gallery. In addition to that, repair crews were on site working on a variety of issues with the dam. This was 10 times the number of people who would be at the plant on a normal workday. What they didn't know was that this would be the deadliest day in the history of any hydroelectric dam in Russia. The crew working this morning were faced with an unusual operations problem. Another power plant in the region had a major fire just the day before. This took the entire production of that facility offline. The Sayano plant normally produced a stable amount of electricity, and the Bratskaya plant served as the frequency control producer. This meant that when electricity needs were low, they would dial back their output, and when it was high, they would adjust up to meet the needs. The plant design at Bratskaya was made for ramping up and down more often than the Sayano plant. Since the frequency duties had been shifted to the Sayano plant the day before, Nikolai and Oleg were hyper-aware of the issues this could cause. For turbine operations, there are safe zones of wattage output, where rotation of the turbine is at a speed that results in the least amount of vibration to the unit. If it rotates too slowly, it will have a high vibration, and if it rotates too quickly, the system will be unstable and dangerously vibrate as well. The units at the Sayano plant had a clearly designated safe zone for operations. This output was measured in megawatts. So when the turbines were starting up, the slowest speeds in Zone 1 were safe up to 265 megawatts. Zone 2 was a highly vibrational speed up to 570 megawatts. Turbines should operate in this zone for the absolute least amount of time possible. The ideal operational zone was Zone 3, where output would be between 570 and 640 megawatts. Over 640 was prohibited. Since this plant was now in the control position, some of its turbines would be moving in and out of the safe zones more frequently. Every time the rotor passes through the high vibrational zone, forces are exerted on the parts of the turbine, potentially fracturing bolts, loosening connections, and causing friction on metal parts. This kind of extra pressure adds up over time, causing damage to the turbine. According to the manufacturer, the life of a turbine is 30 years. On August 17th, Unit 2 had been in use for 29 years and 10 months. Alexander and Roman were part of the group that serviced the turbines and kept everything in safe working order. Unit 2 had been consistently having high vibrational issues, even when operating in the proper safe zone. It had been out of service for repairs several times over the past 10 years, with the most recent repairs welding 5-inch wide cracks inside the turbine. Inexplicably, when these welds were complete, they did not rebalance the runner, which resulted in even more severe vibrations. For June and July, vibrations had been consistently in the unacceptable zone, but the unit continued to operate. The vibration monitoring system showed the increasing severity of vibrations in the first weeks of August to a frightening level. Unit 2 was not taken offline throughout these dangerous vibrational periods, because only the director could authorize such a shutdown. He was under pressure to keep the electricity flowing despite the risks. Finally, in mid-August, they tried some additional repairs to resolve this issue. On Sunday, August 16th, the unit would be started back up for the first time. The neighboring Bratskaya plant's workload was shifted to Sayano on Sunday, and Unit 2 was activated for service. Unit 2's history of vibration problems was well known to the engineers on site. They had constant measure of the amount of vibration, and it had ramped up to an alarming level over the past months. The need for the plant to continue to produce stable levels of electricity for the region kept supervisors from pulling Unit 2 offline completely. As morning dawned, things seemed to be operating as usual. The plant was producing according to the demands of the grid. Unit 2 was vibrating heavily, but otherwise operating as expected. The men were at their stations monitoring conditions when Oleg heard a loud cracking noise in the turbine hall. The vision he turned to see was like nothing he had imagined in his lifetime. The turbine rotor in Unit 2 was blasted up out of the ground in an incredible column of water. The cover to the turbine was blown up through the roof, causing the structure to collapse back down into the room. Visitors and workers were instantly crushed or pinned by a tangle of metal. Oleg was stunned. The sheer volume of water entering the room at that moment was astonishing. Everyone in the room was washed away in a wave of water. Nikolai and dozens of workers were washed out to the river through the open wall of the turbine room. Water crashed down into the turbine gallery and became a river of violently rising water. Oleg pulled himself up a ladder to escape this level. There was only one thing he could do to help this situation: close the headgates to stop the incredible flow of water. As the water poured in through the open hole in the floor, it filled every space. Immediately, all power was lost for the entire dam. Alexander and Roman were down in the engine rooms, below the level of the turbine gallery. They too heard a loud noise from deep inside the turbines, and then everything went black. They were in the dark when the frightening sound of water started splashing on the concrete floors. The staff in those rooms scrambled to the stairwells because the elevators weren't working. But there was nowhere to go. Water rumbled down and filled the stairwells with such speed that the engine rooms were full of water before anyone could escape. Alexander was trapped in a concrete box, floating in the icy river water. The water level was rising so fast he had no way to get out. Oleg started the long journey up many flights of stairs to reach the very top of the dam, where the manual shut-off for the gates was located. A small group had formed with the same plan in mind. Manually shutting the head gates was no easy feat. The men rushed to access the gate room at the top of the dam, but were stopped short by a locked door. No one at the top of the dam had a key, so they ended up breaking the door down to get to the hydraulic jacks. They would manually have to close all 9 open gates. After more than an hour of overwhelming physical exertion, the exhausted men finally closed the gates and stopped the water flowing into the dam's power plant. Police and fire crews had started to arrive to assist with the search and rescue. Several people were found along the banks of the river just beyond the dam, some alive, and others dead. Nikolai had been swept away in a torrent of water, oil, metal, and debris in an uncontrollable tumble. He had been pushed under the flood exiting the dam, barely able to gasp for air before being pushed under again. Eventually, he washed up on the bank of the river where he was able to pull himself out of the water. He was injured and covered in oil, but his only thought was how to get back to find his son Roman. As the day wore on, hundreds of rescuers attempted to locate survivors and start pulling the bodies out of the water. Several hours had passed, and they feared that anyone who had not escaped was certainly dead at this point. The rescue teams were in the water searching for survivors and injured. To their complete surprise, divers heard tapping sounds from down below. They started a methodical search, moving in the direction of the tapping sounds. They checked stairwells, elevators, bathrooms, and workspaces. They encountered body after body, but no survivors. Hours had passed, but the tapping continued. Down in the engine room, Alexander had been tapping on a metal pipe for hours. He was in complete shock at the situation he was facing. The entire room was full of water, and he was pressed to the ceiling trying to breathe in a tiny 4-inch gap. Hour after hour passed, and he was fading, both physically and mentally. Hypothermia had set in, and Alexander could barely keep his nose above the water. He knew that people would be searching for him, but didn't know if he would live to see those rescuers. The water was 40 degrees and generally can kill someone in just 2 to 4 hours. Alexander was barely conscious as a rescue diver came into the room. The diver was stunned to find someone still alive after 15 hours in the icy water. Within an inch of his life, Alexander was rescued. He would be the last person found alive. Sadly, Roman's body would later be recovered from the engine room. Over the next days and weeks, the water was pumped out of the dam, and the damage was assessed. All 10 turbines were damaged or destroyed completely, and Unit 2 was forensically examined. The accumulation of vibration damage had resulted in fatigue cracks in 41 of the 49 bolts recovered. These bolts failed during the maximum vibrations on that Monday morning. At 8:13 a.m., When the failure occurred, the turbine was ramping and operating in the risky Zone 2 at 475 megawatts. The incredible water pressure exerted on the chamber cover exploded up and released 100,000 gallons of water per second. The vibration problem with Unit 2 was well known at the station, and cracks on the cover were visible in the turbine gallery. The accident was investigated, and eventually, the plant director, chief engineer, and 2 deputy directors were sentenced to 6 years in prison for their negligence. Several employees responsible for monitoring this unit were also given prison time for their part. In all, 75 people were killed by being crushed or drowned in the accident. It was a devastating loss to the community. The Russian government paid 1 million rubles to each family that lost a loved one. Homes were given to families with minor children, and educational funds were set up for those children. This accident could have been prevented by simply keeping Unit 2 offline and arranging for its long overdue replacement. This event served as a startling reminder to other directors that safety cannot be taken for granted, and prevention is the only option in such powerful hydroelectric plants.